Today we will explore how medieval farmers managed to grow food in freezing climates, defying extreme temperatures, relentless frosts, and winters that could last for months on end. Before continuing with the video, remember to subscribe to the channel for more documentary narratives like this one. Imagine an open field in northern Europe, sometime between the 9th and 14th centuries. The wind blows cuttingly, carrying with it the first signs of a winter that approaches without mercy. The sky takes on that greyish hue that the peasants knew so well, a silent warning that time was running out. In every village scattered across these frozen lands, men and women worked without rest, driven by a simple and non-negotiable certainty. What they did before the first snow would determine whether their families would starve or survive until the following spring. A single mistake, a single decision made at the wrong time, could mean an empty storehouse when winter reached its peak. But medieval farmers were not helpless in the face of these adversities. Over generations, they developed ingenious methods and solutions that allowed them to wring life from a land that seemed determined to offer nothing. This story begins in autumn, when the air gradually cools and daylight diminishes with each passing day. When the days began to shorten and the mornings brought that bone-chilling cold, medieval villages entered a state of frenetic activity. The first and most important task was the deep ploughing of the fields. Farmers used robust ploughs built with sturdy wood and equipped with iron tips, pulled by oxen trained for this arduous work. These animals dragged the instrument through the soil, turning the earth into deep furrows that exposed the lower layers to the action of air and moisture. If the peasants waited too long, the soil would freeze to the point of becoming completely impermeable to the plough, and precious weeks would be lost. For this reason, autumn ploughing was treated with almost ritualistic urgency. By turning the soil before winter, farmers ensured it remained loose and aerated during the cold months. Nutrients present in the depths were brought to the surface, where they would be available for the roots of the crops the following spring. It was an investment of manual labor, whose return would only be harvested months later. While the ploughs carved their paths through the soil, another equally vital task took place in the stables and pens. Animal manure was considered one of the most valuable resources a medieval farmer could possess. Every bit of waste produced by cattle, sheep, and poultry was meticulously collected. Nothing was wasted. When a sufficient amount had been gathered, farmers spread the manure in thick layers over the newly ploughed fields. Over this layer, they added dry straw and fallen leaves from the trees, creating a protective mulch. This covering acted as a natural thermal insulator, keeping the soil underneath significantly warmer than exposed areas. Records of traditional agricultural practices indicate that this temperature difference could reach about 10 degrees. As the manure and straw slowly decomposed over the cold months, they released essential nutrients that enriched the earth. It was a cycle of natural recycling that medieval peasants mastered with expertise, long before concepts like sustainability were formulated by modern science. There was, however, a silent enemy that could nullify all this work in a matter of days: excess water. When water accumulated in the soil turned into ice, it expanded with a force capable of pushing young roots out of the ground, destroying entire plants. To combat this threat, peasants dug intricate networks of ditches and canals that ran through the fields in carefully planned patterns. These ditches had a precise slope that allowed excess water to flow naturally away from the cultivation areas. In some villages, these drainage systems extended for several kilometers, forming an impressive hydraulic infrastructure for the time. The main canals were fed by smaller ditches that collected water from individual fields, and the whole system functioned as an integrated network. Keeping these systems in good working order required constant vigilance, as a single obstruction could compromise the drainage of an entire sector of fields. The precise timing of these preparatory activities was not left to chance. Communities followed agricultural calendars developed over centuries of observation. Many villages had specific days for the start of ploughing, determined by seasonal indicators and the phases of the moon. There was a widespread belief that land prepared during the waning moon would produce better harvests, a tradition that some farmers maintain to this day. When the first snow finally covered the fields, they appeared empty to an unwary observer. But beneath that seemingly sterile surface, The soil was alive, warmed, nourished, and protected, ready to awaken when the days began to lengthen again. With the land properly prepared, medieval farmers faced their next crucial decision, choosing which plants would be capable of surviving the brutal conditions ahead. There was no room for risky experiments. Every seed planted represented a portion of the family's survival, and choosing the wrong variety could mean months of hunger. Through centuries of trial and error, of lost harvests and bitter lessons, the peasants of these frozen regions learned to identify which plant species had the necessary resistance to face the extreme cold. This knowledge was passed down from generation to generation as a heritage as precious as the land they cultivated itself. Among all the available grains, rye occupied a place of absolute prominence in cold climate agriculture. This extraordinary plant possessed a resistance to cold that no other cereal could match. While wheat succumbed to temperatures that barely dropped below freezing, rye thrived in conditions that would have been fatal to any other grain crop. Farmers planted rye seeds in late autumn, at a time precisely calculated so that the plants would have time to germinate and establish roots before the soil froze completely. Once established, these young plants entered a state of dormancy under the snow cover, remaining alive but metabolically inactive throughout the winter. As soon as temperatures began to rise, even minimally, during the transition to spring, the rye resumed its growth with remarkable vigor, giving farmers extra weeks of plant development compared to crops planted only after the thaw. Archaeological remains found in medieval villages in northern Europe reveal the monumental importance of this grain. More than 70% of all cereals cultivated in these regions was rye. It was the staple of the daily diet, transformed into dense and nutritious breads that sustained entire families through the most difficult months of the year. In addition to grains, medieval farmers relied on hardy vegetables that could withstand frosts without perishing. Turnips, cabbages, and onions formed the triad of fundamental vegetables for survival in cold climates. Each of these plants possessed specific characteristics that made it valuable in such a challenging agricultural scenario. Turnips, for example, developed their tuberous roots below the soil surface, where temperatures remained more stable and less extreme than on the surface exposed to the freezing air. Onions, in turn, accumulated energy reserves in their concentric layers, allowing them to resist periods of moderate cold without suffering irreversible damage. Farmers planted these vegetables in late summer, calculating the time needed for them to reach an advanced stage of maturation before the first severe frosts arrived. But among all these vegetables, cabbage deserved special mention. This versatile plant offered multiple use possibilities that made it indispensable in the medieval diet. A single head of cabbage could feed a family for several days, consumed fresh in salads or soups, cooked in hearty stews, or transformed into sauerkraut, a process of lactic fermentation that preserved the vegetable for months on end without the need for refrigeration. Sauerkraut was not just a form of preservation, it was also a crucial source of vitamin C during the long winter months when fresh fruit simply did not exist. Entire communities depended on this simple preparation to avoid scurvy and other diseases caused by nutritional deficiencies. Medieval farmers also discovered, through patient and persistent observation, that certain combinations of plants grown together produced superior results to those obtained when each species was planted in isolation. Beans and peas, for example, were often sown along with cereals like rye and barley. The stiff stalks of the grain served as natural supports for the climbing stems of the legumes, which wound around them as they grew, eliminating the need for artificial stakes or trellises. In return, the roots of the legumes housed colonies of bacteria, capable of fixing atmospheric nitrogen directly into the soil, enriching it with this essential nutrient that directly benefited the growth of neighboring cereals. It was a relationship of mutual benefit that the peasants exploited with mastery, even without understanding the biological mechanisms behind it. Another ingenious technique consisted of planting low-growing crops between rows of taller plants. The larger plants functioned as natural barriers against biting winds, creating protected zones where smaller, more vulnerable species could develop in relative safety. Historical records indicate that this type of companion planting could increase the total productivity of an area by up to 25%, a difference that, in many cases, separated subsistence from starvation. With their cold-resistant plants firmly rooted in the soil, medieval farmers now faced a challenge that required all their creativity, generating enough heat to protect the crops when temperatures plummeted to threatening levels. Without access to any modern technology, without electricity, without heaters, without industrial greenhouses, they developed ingenious methods that demonstrated an intuitive yet profound understanding of the principles of thermodynamics. One of the most brilliant resources at their disposal was manure-heated beds. Farmers knew from direct experience that fresh animal waste generates considerable heat as it decomposes. This process of microbial decomposition is exothermic, meaning it releases energy in the form of heat, a phenomenon that anyone who has ever touched the inside of a compost pile can confirm. To harness this natural heat, peasants dug shallow trenches in the fields, filled them with fresh manure from horses, cows, or sheep, and covered it all with a thin layer of soil before planting. The heat generated by decomposition could raise the soil temperature by up to 15 degrees above the temperature of the surrounding areas, and this effect lasted for several weeks. This thermal difference was enough to prevent plant roots from freezing, allowing them to continue absorbing water and nutrients, even when the air above the ground was freezing. Wind protection represented another fundamental pillar in the survival strategy of medieval crops. Cold wind could cause severe damage to plants that would otherwise have resisted low temperatures. To combat this effect, peasants built wattle fences. Using flexible branches of willow or hazel, they wove interlocking panels fixed vertically around the cultivation areas. These barriers blocked most of the wind's force, while allowing enough sunlight to pass through for photosynthesis. Gardens protected by these woven fences produced nearly 30% more food than equivalent areas directly exposed to prevailing winds. Medieval farmers also developed primitive but surprisingly effective versions of greenhouses. One of the most ingenious inventions in this regard was cloches, individual bell-shaped covers made of blown glass or translucent clay. Each cloche was placed over an individual plant, creating a small isolated chamber that functioned as a miniature greenhouse. During the day, sunlight penetrated through the transparent or semi-transparent material and heated the air confined inside the cloche. At night, when outside temperatures plummeted, this stored heat was released slowly, keeping the plant protected in a microclimate significantly warmer than the surrounding environment. To protect larger areas, farmers built structures called cold frames, rectangular wooden boxes with transparent lids, usually made of thick glass or oil-rubbed parchment, which covered entire rows of plants. Some of these structures were built with a calculated slope to maximize sunlight capture during the winter months, when the sun remained low on the horizon. These simple devices could extend the growing season by up to 40 days in some locations, an extraordinary gain in regions where every additional day of plant growth represented more food on the table. The most successful medieval gardens combined all these strategies into an integrated system of defense against the cold. Wattle fences formed the first external barrier against the wind. Beneath the plants, manure-heated beds provided upward heat. Above, cloches and cold frames trapped heat and protected the foliage from nightly frosts. It was a layered protection system that, although built with rudimentary materials, demonstrated admirable conceptual sophistication. Beyond artificial heat generation mechanisms, medieval farmers became experts at harnessing natural heat sources already present in their environment. They learned to work with nature instead of fighting against it. The stone walls that delimited fields and properties, for example, were much more than simple fences. Farmers realized that these walls, especially those oriented to the south, functioned as natural thermal accumulators. During sunny hours, the stone mass absorbed solar energy. At night, this energy was gradually released in the form of radiant heat, creating a milder microclimate strip along the entire length of the wall. Peasants planted their most delicate crops next to these south-facing walls. In particularly cold regions, some communities even built curved walls designed to concentrate this thermal effect, creating pockets of heat where frost-sensitive plants could survive. The position of the fields in relation to the sun was another factor carefully considered. South-facing slopes received up to 40% more sunlight than flat terrain in the northern regions of Europe, which translated into warmer soil and significantly better growing conditions. Farmers reserved these privileged positions for their most important, or cold-vulnerable crops. Records from monastery gardens confirm that herbs planted on south-facing slopes matured up to 2 weeks earlier than specimens grown in less favorable positions, a decisive difference in regions where the growing season was already dramatically short. Perhaps the most creative use of natural heat came from the strategic placement of gardens near animal shelters. A large stable, housing about 20 cows, could increase the temperature in adjacent areas by up to 4 degrees during cold nights, enough to save an entire crop from a severe frost. Some communities built their dwellings and animal shelters on the north side of their gardens so that they served simultaneously as windbreaks and sources of residual heat. In certain cases, smoke outlets from fireplaces were directed to pass under raised beds before dispersing into the air, providing direct heating to the plant roots. With their cultivation areas heated by both artificial and natural means, medieval farmers turned their attention to another challenge of vital importance: the preservation of seeds and plant materials that would ensure the restart of the agricultural cycle when winter finally gave way to spring. Without viable seeds, all the accumulated knowledge, all the prepared land, and all the protection systems would be useless. Seeds were, without exaggeration, a medieval farmer's most valuable possession, the link that connected one growing season to the next. Proper drying was the first and most critical step in the preservation process. Shortly after the harvest, farmers spread the seeds on clean fabrics in sunny and well-ventilated places. There they remained for days, sometimes weeks, until all residual moisture had completely evaporated. Peasants knew, through painfully acquired experience over generations, that any trace of moisture was an invitation to deterioration. Damp seeds could develop fungi that would silently destroy them, or worse, they could germinate prematurely in their storage containers, wasting all the vital energy they were supposed to reserve for sowing in the following season. Once completely dry, the seeds were transferred to carefully prepared clay pots. Clay possessed ideal properties for this function. It was impermeable enough to prevent the entry of insects and rodents, but porous enough to allow minimal air circulation that prevented mold formation. Some communities added repellent herbs like tansy inside the containers to ward off insects. Most seeds kept best at cool temperatures, slightly above the freezing point. To achieve these ideal conditions, farmers used underground cellars or chambers dug into hillsides. These spaces maintained temperature variations of only 5 degrees throughout the entire year, a level of thermal stability achieved without any artificial climate control mechanism. Tubers and roots intended for replanting required different care. Carrots, turnips, and other edible roots were packed in slightly damp sand inside wooden barrels or in stone-lined pits dug below the soil's frost line. The damp sand prevented the tubers from drying out, while the constant temperature below the ground, maintained between approximately 1 and 4 degrees above freezing, was enough to keep the plant tissues alive in a state of dormancy without stimulating premature sprouting. Aromatic and medicinal herbs received special treatment. Many were transplanted into pots and taken inside houses or monasteries, where they remained alive throughout the winter on south-facing windowsills, providing fresh seasoning and ensuring healthy specimens for replanting in the following season. While their carefully stored seeds and plants awaited warmer days, medieval farmers discovered something that defied intuition. The winter cold, that same relentless enemy they fought with such determination, could, in certain circumstances, be turned into an ally. This realization revealed a maturity of agricultural thinking that transcended simple resistance to adversity and entered the territory of strategic adaptation. Snow, in particular, played a protective role that the peasants learned to value and even desire. A thick layer of snow over the fields acted as a natural insulating blanket, protecting dormant plants from the much more intense cold that reigned in the air above it. During the worst cold snaps, when outside temperatures plummeted to lethal levels, the temperature under a snow cover could be up to 30 degrees higher than that of the exposed air. Winter wheat and rye, those hardy crops that had been planted in the autumn, benefited enormously from this natural protection. Fields that remained covered by snow throughout the winter produced up to 20% more grain than fields where plants were exposed directly to the freezing air. Medieval farmers observed the snow cover with vigilant attention, knowing that abundant and persistent snow was, paradoxically, a good omen for the following year's harvest. The intelligent management of water from ice represented another ingenious strategy developed by medieval peasants. Some farmers deliberately created shallow puddles in their fields during the autumn, knowing that these accumulations of water would freeze during the winter. When spring arrived, and these layers of ice began to melt slowly, they provided a constant and gradual supply of water to the fields at exactly the moment when young plants most needed irrigation. It was a natural irrigation system that worked with the precision of a controlled release mechanism, frozen in winter, thawing slowly in spring, delivering moisture to the soil for weeks during the most critical phase of the growth cycle. Ancient agricultural records mention specially prepared ice fields that provided water for up to 3 weeks during the crucial early spring period, when natural precipitation was often insufficient for the needs of germinating crops. The repeated cycle of freezing and thawing during the winter also produced an unexpected beneficial effect on soils that were particularly difficult to work. Heavy clay soils, which became a compact and almost impermeable mass when soaked, became significantly easier to manage after being subjected to the rigors of winter. The most perceptive farmers exploited this phenomenon deliberately, ploughing their clay fields in the autumn and leaving the coarse furrows exposed to winter weather. The water that penetrated the fissures of the ploughed soil froze, and as it expanded, it fragmented the compacted clods into smaller pieces. This process repeated several times throughout the winter, and when spring arrived, the soil that was previously as hard as brick had been naturally transformed into a looser and more malleable mass, much easier to work with the rudimentary implements available at the time. This technique could reduce soil preparation work in the spring by up to 40%, a savings in human and animal effort that was extremely valuable in an era where all available energy was generated by muscles. Winter barley also benefited directly from the melting snow. Some farmers sowed their seeds just before the first predicted snowfall. The seeds remained dormant under the snow cover, perfectly positioned to germinate the instant temperatures rose and the snow melted around them. The abundant moisture provided by the melting snow accelerated germination and gave young plants a natural protection against the dry periods that frequently occurred in early spring. Fields planted in this way sprouted 7 to 10 days before those sown only after all the snow had melted, a significant temporal advantage in climates where the growing season was relentlessly short. With winter now serving as an ally instead of just an adversary, medieval farmers turned their attention to another critical aspect of their survival: the exact timing of the harvest. In a climate where every day counted, and where the difference between abundance and scarcity could be measured in hours, harvesting at the right time was a skill as vital as planting correctly. The predominant strategy was the staggered harvest, a method that distributed work over weeks and maximized the quality and durability of the collected food. Instead of trying to harvest everything at once, farmers divided their fields and gardens into sequential harvest zones, each with its own scheduled date based on climate observations accumulated over generations. Many villages maintained up to 5 or 6 distinct harvest zones, each monitored separately and harvested when its specific crops reached the ideal point of maturation. Initial harvests began with short-cycle vegetables, those that matured most quickly and would not benefit from additional time in the field. Tubers and roots, on the other hand, received the opposite treatment. Turnips, parsnips, and carrots were deliberately left in the soil until the last possible moment before the arrival of severe frost. This prolonged stay in the cold earth was not negligence. It was a calculated strategy. The cool soil of late autumn acted as a kind of natural refrigerator that slowed the deterioration of plant tissues, improved the flavor of the tubers by concentrating their natural sugars, and significantly increased their shelf life after harvest. Tubers harvested just before the first severe frost could last up to 30% longer in storage than those dug up weeks earlier, a difference that meant fresh food for more days during the winter. Medieval farmers also discovered that frost could be transformed into a flavor enhancer for certain crops. Vegetables like kale and certain types of cabbage developed a remarkably sweeter flavor after being exposed to light frosts. This phenomenon, which modern science explains as the conversion of starches into simple sugars in response to thermal stress, was empirically known and exploited by peasants for centuries. Records from monasteries indicate that kale harvested after 3 frost episodes contained significantly more vitamin C than specimens harvested during the summer. A nutritional benefit that, even without being understood in scientific terms, was perceived in the health of the communities that adopted this practice. Determining the precise moment for these harvests required an impressive meteorological knowledge for the time. Communities developed forecasting methods based on natural signs that combined observations of cloud patterns, animal behavior, changes in wind direction and intensity, and even indicators as curious as the thickness of onion skins. These folk weather forecasting methods correctly predicted the date of the first severe frost, with a margin of error of only 5 days in more than 70% of cases, a remarkable success rate for an era before any meteorological instruments. With the harvest safely gathered before winter tightened its siege, medieval farmers still kept one last card up their sleeve. Growing fresh food during the winter months, when snow covered the ground and temperatures made any outdoor agricultural activity seemingly impossible, seemed like a contradiction in terms. However, medieval peasants and monks developed methods that allowed them to produce fresh greens even in the most adverse conditions. This winter production was not a luxury, it was a vital necessity. The lack of fresh vegetables during the cold months led to severe nutritional deficiencies, including scurvy, a disease caused by a lack of vitamin C that could debilitate and even kill if not treated. Monasteries were at the forefront of this agricultural innovation. With their robust stone buildings and their organized and disciplined communities, monks created protected cultivation spaces that functioned year-round. Many monastic kitchens maintained small gardens in south-facing windows, where herbs like thyme, parsley, and chives could grow continuously, benefiting from stable indoor temperatures and the sunlight that entered through the openings. Records from a monastery in Germanic territory reveal that the monks harvested fresh herbs at least twice a week throughout the winter, providing essential vitamins that protected the community from deficiency diseases that threatened less organized populations. Outside the monastery walls, ordinary farmers also found ways to grow greens during the winter. Compost-heated gardens represented one of the most creative solutions. Large piles of fresh manure and decomposing plant remains generated considerable heat, with temperatures in the center of an active pile potentially exceeding 38 degrees. Medieval horticulturists positioned cold-tolerant crops, such as cabbage seedlings and certain herbs, in the vicinity of these steaming piles. The zone located up to 1 meter away from a large compost pile could remain up to 20 degrees warmer than the surrounding areas of the garden, creating a favorable microclimate where plants could grow slowly, even during the coldest periods. Grain sprouting offered yet another source of fresh food during the winter. When all other cultivation methods proved insufficient, families turned to sprouting wheat, barley, and rye inside their homes. This process required only simple containers, a little water, and ambient temperatures minimally above freezing, conditions that could be found in any dwelling, however humble. Sprouted grains were ready for consumption in just 5 to 7 days, a production speed that no other crop could match. In addition to speed, sprouted grains offered a significantly superior nutritional profile compared to dry grains. The germination process increased nutrient content by up to 40%, transforming a staple food into a concentrated source of vitamins and minerals. This simple technique helped fill nutritional gaps during the harshest weeks of winter, when all other sources of fresh food were exhausted. Some communities went even further, building partially underground cultivation chambers, where the natural heat of the earth provided additional protection against surface temperatures. South-facing stone walls absorbed sunlight during the day and radiated heat during the night, creating a rudimentary but functional greenhouse effect that allowed for the continuous cultivation of hardy greens. With these creative methods of winter food production established, it remained for medieval farmers to master one last essential skill to ensure their survival year after year: maintaining soil health throughout the harsh winters and the successive growing seasons. Without fertile soil, all other knowledge and techniques would be useless. The earth was the foundation of everything, and keeping it healthy was as important as any other agricultural activity. Field rotation constituted the cornerstone of the medieval soil conservation strategy. Farmers divided their arable land into 3 large plots and alternated the use of each in a 3-year cycle. On the first plot, they planted winter cereals such as rye or wheat. On the second, they grew spring crops such as barley, oats, or legumes. The third plot was left fallow, completely uncultivated, for an entire year. This resting plot was not wasted land, as a hasty observer might conclude. The soil in this field had 12 full months to recover from the depletion caused by previous crops, naturally replenishing its nutrient stores, its physical structure, and its populations of beneficial organisms. Analysis of ancient agricultural records demonstrates that this 3-field system increased average productivity by approximately 1/3 compared to fields used continuously without rest. A substantial gain that helps explain why this practice became practically universal in medieval farming communities across northern Europe. The addition of natural fertilizers maintained soil richness even during the cold months, when biological activity slowed down. Ashes from domestic fireplaces and stoves, far from being discarded as waste, were carefully collected and spread over the fields. These ashes contained essential minerals, primarily potassium and calcium, which plants needed for healthy development. Animal bones, crushed into a coarse powder, were incorporated into the soil to add phosphorus, a fundamental nutrient for the growth of strong and resistant roots, exactly what plants needed to survive the rigors of winter. Cover crops represented another fundamental tool in the medieval soil conservation arsenal. As soon as a crop was removed from the field, farmers quickly sowed fast-growing plants like clover and vetch. These plants possessed an extraordinary capacity. Their roots housed symbiotic bacteria capable of capturing nitrogen directly from the atmosphere and storing it in specialized nodules on the roots. When the following spring, farmers plowed these cover crops under, incorporating them directly into the soil, all the accumulated nitrogen was released and became available for subsequent crops. In addition to this chemical enrichment, cover crops performed an equally vital physical function. Their roots and foliage protected the topsoil, the most fertile and vulnerable layer, against erosion caused by autumn rains, winter winds, and the runoff from spring snowmelt. Marling was a special technique practiced in many cold climate regions. Farmers dug up chalky clay known as marl from deep underground deposits and spread it over their fields. This clay acted as a natural corrective for acidic soils, raising the pH to levels more favorable for crop growth. The practice was considered so valuable that the right to dig marl was often specified in agricultural lease contracts. Livestock played a dual role in maintaining soil fertility. After the harvest, farmers released their herds to graze in the fields, where the animals fed on crop residues while depositing fresh manure exactly where it was most needed. Movable fences were repositioned regularly to ensure an even distribution of the natural fertilizer. Green manuring was practiced when farmers intentionally grew a crop for the sole purpose of incorporating it into the soil. Plants like mustard were sown and allowed to grow until flowering, at which point they were plowed and mixed into the earth while still green. As this plant mass decomposed, it released nutrients and added organic matter that improved soil structure. Winter care also included digging drainage ditches to prevent water accumulation in the fields. Fields with efficient drainage systems could be sown weeks before poorly drained ones. The snow itself contributed to the preservation of soil life. Beneath this white mantle, microscopic organisms and small invertebrates survived the winter, maintaining the essential biological processes that sustained the Earth's fertility. Many farmers observed the appearance of snow fleas, tiny jumping insects that emerged to the surface during sunny winter days, as a sign that the soil remained biologically active and healthy. When the last frost dissipated and the first signs of warmth began to transform the landscape, the fields so meticulously cared for over months of tireless work were ready to receive the seeds of the new season. And so a cycle was completed that repeated year after year, generation after generation, a silent testimony to the resilience, ingenuity, and unwavering determination of those who cultivated the land in conditions that many would consider impossible. The medieval farmers of freezing climates left behind no scientific treatises or formal records of their discoveries. But they left something perhaps more valuable, the living proof that human ingenuity, allied with patient observation of nature and the community transmission of knowledge, can overcome adversities that would seem insurmountable. Every technique they developed, from manure-heated beds to the strategic use of snow as a protective blanket, represented an elegant solution to a concrete problem, born not in laboratories or universities, but in the frozen fields where hunger was a real and present threat. And that is how we reach the end of this journey through the frozen fields of medieval Europe. A trip that showed us that the agricultural wisdom of our ancestors was much more sophisticated than we usually imagine. If this narrative sparked your curiosity and made you look at the past with new eyes, consider subscribing to this channel to continue discovering extraordinary stories like this one, which often remain hidden between the lines of history. Leave your comment telling us which of the medieval techniques surprised you the most. And don't forget to like this content so it reaches more people passionate about knowledge. Just as those medieval farmers planted seeds in the autumn, trusting in the future harvest, every subscription and every like you leave is a seed that helps this channel grow and produce more documentaries like this one. The next narrative is already being prepared, and you won't want to miss it.